Hello, everyone. My name is Caldwell Manners, and I'll be hosting this evening session here. Welcome to this webcast on this International Domestic Workers Day. In our society, domestic workers are people we are unable to live without. They are persons that we can all relate to, regardless of our class or our economic strata. We all know domestic workers. Some might be as old as our grandmothers, and some might be in their early teens. I would not be surprised if there are even younger domestic workers. They're mostly women and girls, and many of them are climate migrants who have left behind a dying agricultural economy due to many issues faced by farmers and our environment in the Meghalaya countryside. What we know for sure is that domestic workers are especially at risk due to their isolation in private homes and their exclusion from many key labor protections. For example, even the government passed the Sexual Harassment of Women at Workplace Prevention Prohibition Redressal Act in 2013, which is a significant advancement, but a 2020 Human Rights Watch report found that it had been poorly enforced. During this pandemic, many have lost wages and employment due to the lockdown in general and also due to the fear of the virus. Sometimes it's been very expensive to stay employed because they have to take public transportation that's unavailable. And I think many of these stories are things that we can relate to. And but what we know for sure is that their futures need to be guaranteed, that their rights need to be upheld. So this evening, we want to welcome you, and I want to welcome our panelists to this International Domestic Workers Day. We have with us Kongwan Punhun Karsante, who's the Advocacy and Lobbying Coordinator for the National Domestic Workers Movement in the Meghalaya region. Kong Bajoplin Karmudai, President of the All Meghalaya Domestic Workers Union. We have Kong Angela Rangat, social activist from Tur. And we have Dr. M. Amparin Lungdo, member Meghalaya Legislative Assembly. Welcome to all of you. Thank you for joining us this evening. As I mentioned earlier, domestic workers are people we meet every day, people we interact with every day. And it's quite unfortunate that we live in a time where their rights are not even guaranteed. So I would just like to maybe start with Kongwan Punhun. Could you give us an overview of what is the state of the domestic workers, in terms of their rights, in terms of their ability to work, their protections in our state today?
Good evening, everyone. Among all categories of the informal sector workers, the protection of domestic workers forms one of the biggest challenges to labor laws. The inherent subjugation involved in the work, along with the atypical nature of the work of domestic workers, make them more vulnerable than other workers in the economy. The difficulties associated with the work being performed within the household, which is primarily for non-commercial purpose and private. The workspace being a private space makes regulation and implementation more difficult. And with regard, in the context of the state of Meghalaya, as far as we have been working with the domestic workers for the past 13 to 14 years, there is no exact comprehensive legislation that the government has so far implemented in favor of domestic workers. We can only remember during the tenure of Madam Amparin Lungdo as the Labour Minister, yes, she has successfully include domestic workers in the schedule of minimum wage. And apart from that, there is nothing much more that the government has been doing so far for the domestic workers. Absence of labor legislations has really bring down the domestic workers in terms of the rights, in terms of the protection, in terms of the dignity at work, and even in terms of the daily survival for their livelihood.
Is Kongba Joplin with us? I don't see her. I think she. Oh, she is. Okay. Thank you, Kong Wan Hun, for that. Kongba Joplin, I had a question for you. Could you talk about maybe some of the experiences that domestic workers have had during this pandemic? How has it affected them? Yeah.
As we have found that during these 2 years of pandemic, during this lockdown of COVID-19, so the all over Meghalaya, as we has been surveyed, most of our domestic workers have already been lost their job. So lost our job is very difficult for us, since we are not working only for clothes, for food and all, but we are already new, as 75% of our domestic workers are single mother. So we are working this job, we are doing this work uh, in order to feed our family. So loss to be faced that we are lost our job. So it seems that we are unable to fulfill our family demand. Like we have to pay school fees, we have to even to for house rent, and even if we got a positive, the government doesn't pay for us. But thank God, during these 2 years we have like all over our domestic workers from our group, from our movement, we didn't get the information that all the domestic workers are facing this
I think we have a few connection problems there. Um, but Dr. Ampareen, it seems like this is a there's some legislative issues that need to be dealt with in terms of guaranteeing the rights of domestic workers. For example, India has not ratified the ILO Convention of 189, and as Kongwan Punhun also mentioned, a comprehensive legislation for the protection of domestic workers. Where is that in terms of the agenda of the government right now? What kind of priority does it have?
I will not be able to speak on behalf of the government because we are in the opposition. But yes, we have been rallying the rights of domestic workers. In fact, it was in 2017 that we were able to include domestic workers in the labor list of eligible beneficiaries under various government schemes. However, we cannot wait for legislation. We need to act quickly. So even at our own levels as MLAs, we have access to some amount of funds, which, if used and utilized productively and focused on enabling, supporting, supplementing domestic workers who are at the moment under fire because of their inability to move out of their homes to work. So, at my own level, as we speak, I have already begun what I call the MLA's wage loss assistance, and domestic workers are in the ambit of my scheme. In fact, as we speak, transfers are being made from my personal account to domestic workers across my constituency. Unfortunately, I have to speak constituency centric, and I have to also act constituency centric because at the moment, funding made available to us has not come. We are just hearing that there are some funds that will be allocated to MLAs. So, wage loss assistance under the purview of the MLA of 16 East Shillong will cover not just domestic workers, we're also covering commercial vehicle drivers, we're also covering single mothers, we're also covering domestic workers. And I'm fortunate that I have access and I know my people pretty efficiently, so I'm able to directly transfer to their accounts 2,000 rupees each. I will not have the exact numbers of my coverage, but as we speak every day, I will be on the job. And in fact, I have already started the work and I am in touch with Madam Wanpanhun, who is assisting me because she has direct links with the people in my constituency. And as far as government is concerned, I cannot say, I cannot speak. This second wave of the pandemic has taken us all by great surprise and has really inconvenienced all of us. So I will be on the job, I will be working hard, and I'm sure that while we wait for government to take a collective policy for a plan of action to be carried out, uh, we can, as MLAs, start off all assistance possible to this very deprived and underprivileged sector of workers in the unorganized sections.
Thank you. Kongangela, this obviously the nature of domestic workers is extremely gendered, and the experience of many women and girls in this workforce has been, doubly difficult because of their gender. As in your work, what have you seen and what have you observed regarding some of the hardships that many of the domestic workers are facing?
Thank you, Caldwell, for the question. Um, it's true that a greater percentage of domestic workers are women, and being women workers, they obviously are tasked with the double burden of being a bread earner as well as the usual roles of being a mother, um, woman within the domestic space. And in our interactions with people who are um, domestic workers, it's a big thing when you're trying to look after a child and a child is sick and you can't go to work, and you have employers who don't understand that the fact that you may also be a single mother, and you lose your wages for the days you don't go to work. Then we have seen and also followed up on some cases. You mentioned about sexual harassment at the workplace. We know for a fact that many domestic workers also face harassment, but we know that the remedy or the grievance redressal for that is so much more complex. In a formal workspace, it's easier to complain. But as per even the Sexual Harassment Act, actually all the deputy commissioners are supposed to have the sexual harassment officers to whom you can issue complaints. But we know that the sexual harassment cells for the non-formal sector workers is actually not operational in most districts, including ours. So those are some of the issues I think that many domestic workers face, and the fact that the work is so invisible at one level. As you said, we all need them. Many of us are able to step out to work because they enable us to step out to work. Without the help of somebody helping us in the house, performing the tasks which we need to fulfill every day in and day out, many of us will be so burdened, unable to even do what we have to do to earn our living. And yet, there is that invisibilization of domestic workers. And even if, the recently now they have been put into the minimum wages schedule, however, their work is still categorized as unskilled. When actually when you look at it, depending on what work they're engaged in, you can categorize the work, the service they render as semi-skilled or even skilled. You know, for years they're doing this work. They may not be able to do the work better than you and I. Some of them are actually carers of the elderly. That's a very skilled work that they're engaged in, or even looking after children. And yet, some of these things have not been considered. Even though, as a union, the Domestic Workers Association has tried to push for this, even in terms of negotiation of leave, some of these things have not been considered, which adds to the burden of being a domestic worker and a woman domestic worker.
Kongwan Panhun, what do you, in your work, in your organizing work, what do you see as what's on the top of your agenda? What needs to be done legislatively so that these guarantees are given to domestic workers? And what do you see as the major obstacles to something like that?
Pardon me, Carlo, I didn't hear it properly. Network problem.
Sure, I can repeat myself. What is in the union? What is on the top of your agenda? What do you think needs to be done? You had mentioned about the comprehensive legislation that needs to be passed. What do you feel are the major obstacles to a comprehensive legislation from being passed right now? Why is it not being passed?
When we speak about the comprehensive legislation of domestic workers, of course, we know it's difficult, but it's not impossible. See, like, for example, I would say, like, there are some states in India who have already fixed wages for domestic workers. Like Rajasthan have done that, Kerala have done that, Andhra Pradesh have done that, and then some states have also initiate and constitute welfare board in favor of the domestic workers. Uh, Taking maybe, like, we can say, for example, Maharashtra have done that, and the other southern states have also done that. If other states in India can do that, why not the state of Meghalaya? Hakabaya day but kani nga kwa bankaran hakakasiru namat ba kani ka program kaday nakabanta ki domestic workers lani kinong triyan hakababuan na kini kinong triyan kinong sotu lesi kaktiyan nong way mo kajing kaba ki brio batraying brio kiya kundo along ba kajing lesi ngala banong baka sorkar hi mo naru na center kala feel ban pentray kam ya ki an ban ay ya kajing yada nakabanta ki brio batraying brio ngimla banlen baha usnem 8,000 khatway ka ILO kalapas ya ka convention haka kerteng jong ki domestic workers kata decent work for domestic workers but kala entrasu ya ki member states rani ki countries baki dai ban pentrai kam ya kani ka convention da ka ba kishna ya kita ki legislation rani ki ain ban ai jing ya dai ki privatrai ing bre hadu menta ngiyo iba arho khandai dili kiri saudong ka perthai kila pentrai kam kila ratify kani ka convention kila pentrai kam hendai ka basgosi kalong ba kari India ha ka house number ka ILO ka pass ya kani ka convention I was there ngadon haka tu ka UN room haka por ba ki pass kani ka convention for Geneva ka India as one of the member state kala support kani ka convention hundai ba ka ai pat ka ba penlong ka sarkar India bakan sakut bakan ratify lani bakan nempentrai kami kani ka convention kidan pat kiwi kiri hadian ba la kaya kala pass kani ka convention wat laga kim pat ratify ya kani ka convention ru kila sedang ban pentrai kam ya ki national legislation hakiri jong jong ban ai jing ya dai ki domestic workers ye I kidan katu kadi ki private members bill ki ba la introduce hapo lok sabha ma ko parliament hendrai wat hadin jong kajingwan ra jong kini ki MP ya kabil na kabenta ki nong traying brio ngi iba ka sorkar ka snap kuman mo ti ngamong ba lesi ba kadai ka kamram jong ka sorkar India banle kani namar lada ki bai ki sorkar jilla kumha po Maharashtra ha Assam ha Rajasthan Andhra Pradesh Jharkhand kila banwanra ekata ka ain ban ai jingya da ka baki pu eka dor tray jo ki nong traying da ka baki bu ekata ka welfare board ka banwanra mo ya kita ki scheme ki ban ai jing mentoy na ka benta ki nong traying balai ka sorkar Meghalaya jungi kamla da ki snem ka sorkar Meghalaya jungi kala snap kuman halor kani ki memorandums halor ki memorandums ki jing dawa halor ki jing usnam ngimi ki surak bangin dawa na ka benta ki hok jong ki nong traying undai tang nam ta ki hok jong ki nong traying ki ka hok jong baro ki nong tray bela ka network ka bangi ngia tray rengkat bat ki we ki ngimi jan mat manla usnam haki surok bangin dawa na ka sorkar na ka benta ka hok ka jong lesi jong unong belas ngi ba im na ka kamai mensta
I think we've lost Kongwan Punhun. Am I the only one who cannot hear her? Or have you?
No, we can't hear her either.
We
Okay.
can't hear her.
Kong Bajablin, right now, what do you think the government needs to do to assist domestic workers at this moment? What is the immediate need, and what do you say is the most urgent thing that you would want the government to do to respond to the needs of domestic workers today? The state of Meghalaya to respond.
Hakabayade bat ni kinong bella te ngasngo don kam bandawa na ka sorkar ba kin ai jingyarap yani ki nong bella yang bremo ki ba bella minstep bandamit te ha kumbalong kanika second wave jong kanika ba suddenly bekir kom ong jong ka government ba kin don kata ka total lockdown te namangi ni de kinong bela ki bela mesti bam damit ngim judan kita ki pisa ban ngin pelang ndrei ha tu ka jing ong jong ka government ba kin khang no ya ka snong ya ka ri jongi nani ka barok ko ka sor silong ban long ka total lockdown te ngi kum kinong trei ngi kendo ngi shem jing e shibun namar ni ladu ya ka kam kakti ke jongi habang idu iki kami kiti jongi ngidu ya ka bainong ka jongi teladang idu ya ka bainong ka mut kakta ya ka yeng ka sen ka jongi ngidu ya ka ta ka bai khau phun chu dan bok ha kini ki por ki bamenta ka bai school jam ki khun ki nong hi kai na school kin pat ong ban siu ndra ni smu thu hi ban da la ple hi kini ka lockdown la khamnu stam mal malaru kata ka jing sha ban pha siu ya ka bai school jam ki khun kan don hi te de na ta ka daw ka ai ka bangi ni kum ka president jong ka seng mo nga wa man ong ba mangi hi ki nong bela ki ba kendu e kini ki jing e ladang ngim phai khmat cha government chano pat ngim phai khmat ken manu bala banyarap pat yangi kadai tang ka government hi ka banyarap yangi lada ka government hi ka kloy ban ai ya ka kti ka mon ka kti ka diang jong ki ta ka mangi ki nong bala ni kham ni yo ya ka ta ka bor ken thindian ho kimla ban kersan ka bubun ka baba ni su thu hi rei haba lada kiwi kiwi ki states ki lala ban penlong anyo ya kane ka lane ban ra ya ki domestic workers ya ka welfare board no kumbala ong imeson punhon mentan te ki state ki ba marjan bat niru ki ladon la ka jong ka welfare board na banta jong ka domestic workers te ka state jongi pan balai hadu menta ka dang feel te ka jing dawa ka jongi kum ki union na ka government ka long bet tang ba kin yaram lem yangi kinong belas ni bat bakin ai ya kata ka hok ka jongi ya ka bangi ni de banyo
Dr. Ampareen, seems pretty clear that there's much need and it is a systemic issue, right? It's what you are doing as a uh, MLA is for your constituency, but there needs to be a systemic response to a systemic problem. Um, on what Jocelyn said, there's not much that they can expect from the government. I wonder if we as citizens or domestic workers need to have that kind of expectation from the government, and what is preventing the government from bringing these forms of redressal, grievance redressal, and a forum where there is a systemic solution to the guaranteeing of rights. Like what can you do in the opposition, right? Or what would you have if what would you do if you were the part of the government in power to bring in a systemic change? Because it seems like that's what we need today.
Very true. I mean, these are all very real situations. And in fact, the lockdown has given us a very valuable lesson. Here is a situation where you have actually seen the extent at which there is a deprivation in these unorganized sectors in and around the state of Meghalaya. East Khasi Hills, particularly, has been badly hit. Uh, while we were in government, we had tried to envisage a policy that would be focused primarily to the needs of domestic workers, along the same lines of protecting their rights. Uh, there were certain requirements, if I remember correctly. We needed the formation of agencies who would be the go-betweens between the house owner, the worker, and the government to oversee whether or not rights of domestic workers were covered and protected. Then there was the other area which required some amount of thinking, which never got finished because elections 2018 came. That area being the fact that who would uh, who would codify the wage of a worker under various slabs of available and under the purview of the labor department. The other thing was we needed to also look at where would be the sourcing of this additional fund that would be required to initiate substantial assistance for this category of unorganized workers. We had already instituted several CES, and each of these CES under various heads, under various goods and services that are available within the resources of the state, were already designated for other more urgent requirements like education, building and other construction workers. So there is all the this other responsibility that again government would have to take into consideration before offering any any specific policy for this sector of workers. And there was also an attempt made by previous governments to ensure that workers of this category could also have safe homestays. We were also looking at areas where children of domestic workers would be, adequately taken care of under various crutches, so that when a mother leaves the home, there is assurance that children are well taken care of in these crutches. So there were all these attempts that had been made, but surely uh, the IOL gratification for domestic workers would be the ultimate focus if it was doable in a state like Meghalaya. Uh, as of today, uh, I'm happy to be privy to all of these suggestions of important people who have joined this webinar. And surely I will find spaces in various upcoming assemblies to try and threadbare discuss these issues and bring them to the forefront for the government's attention.
Kongaja, let me put the similar question to you in terms of in your work, you've been asking the government questions for a long time. What do you think needs to be done for a systemic um, address of of the rights of domestic workers from from a legislative perspective? From what could the government do to address this?
Right. I think first and foremost, there has to be a formal recognition and acknowledgement of domestic workers being workers who contribute to our state's economy. Meaning that if domestic workers are not there, several other workers will not be able to function. Okay. And beginning from there, we need to then accord the value to domestic work that it requires. As of now, we know that people think that it's work which is unskilled, which is easily a domestic worker is easily replaceable, but that's not a fact. And so starting from there, that should inform policies. For instance, a simple thing which I think the Domestic Workers Association here has been fighting for is the welfare board, which will then look at certain social securities for a domestic worker. As of now, it's a struggle to even attain leave when they need leave. There is no payment for overtime work. It's expected that you work if you want to keep your job. And even in terms of looking at a kind of a long-term retirement plan, these things are possible. And it can be rooted through a welfare board. But in addition to this, I don't think that there's anything that prevents a government from bringing in policies or even legislations. For instance, if we can have the Shops and Establishments Act, which regulates hours of work, which regulates payments, which regulates leave, surely there can also be a directive which talks about the need of ensuring that employers of domestic workers adhere to certain norms which comply with certain legislations which are already there, which uphold workers' rights. So it is very much possible. But the other thing which we need to understand also is that there are other entitlements which have to go hand in hand with ensuring the rights of domestic workers. And these will come from a joint struggle of different workers movements. For instance, many years ago with the Domestic Workers Association, we fought for the revision of the minimum wage. Similarly, now we need to fight to ensure that healthcare is something that is assured, to domestic workers and others. Or food entitlements. Even on the food entitlements, it was a fight to ensure that domestic workers fall under the AAY category of entitlements. So it has to be a more comprehensive and holistic approach, because they ought not to be seen just as domestic workers, as workers, but as citizens who have full rights, in every other sphere in a state.
Kong Wan Panhun and Kong Bajoplin, as we kind of come to the end of these 45 minutes, I was wondering, in honor of domestic workers today, do you have a message for the domestic workers in this state today? And would you like to say something to them?
Yes, thank you again, Caldwell and the other panelists. Kakubor hi kabangi kwa ban ai ya ki domestic workers lani kinong treyeng lani ki para dukhot jongi badan ko seng jongi kadong ba what happening ki bun bijing what happening jong kajingele ba ka sarkar kam shimpar la ithu epi kum kinong treyu ngai ni ai pat kata kamen ba kakti kamon kakti kadyang ka jongi kandon kat bat hi kum kaseng ginja rengkat bangin yele ban penyo kita ki hok ki jong pi kum kinong trei hoi hakani ka jing rakhi jongi yakani ka si buram ka jong kinong trei brio kani kam kut hangni mata kasni ngindon se ki ki program lashai kasni lashisni ke hakabangin sab ngin kha egini ki dor khas ki jongi ngaladak banekran pat ki MP ki jongi Dr. W Kharlukhi iba mikmat hakar Rajya Sabha ngalayo banekran ru badi madam agatha sangma kini kilakloy ban shimti ban ra kini ki issues ki jong ki pre batre imbreo hapo ka assembly parliament ti kador khas ngin sapin poi shiki hakajo kapor kidang don ru sakiwai pada ki campaigns ki bangin ya kum ka poster campaign jing leta ki poster ka ba ngin pen ya ki demands na ki jing dawa jong ki breo batre imbreo lada compare kadai ka hok ka jongi kat bangim pat yo ngin dawa ngin jai dawa bat ngin pan namar undai ba kila isin ai yangi kadai ka hok ka jongi lada ki bai kiri kila ban pentrei ka me ka an ban ai jinga dai ki pre batre imbreo balai hari India kimla lani balai hakat jila ka jongi kimla ti ki don ru katu kani ki slogans ki bangi apun kre ti ngin yashim bentalang bat ki dukhat ki jongi don ki program hawa ni sotu kadon ka jing hapdeng jong ka klam ngimla ban mobilize ani banlum yashibun ki dukhat hakani ka campaign ka jongi hingrai banum pen khain ya kita ki protocol ani ki kendon ki baka sarkar kalabu nginlum ya ki dukhat hakata karukam ba nginla ban boot ya ki kendon ki baka sarkar kalabu ka social distancing but kiwai te lengba kan ka khubor ngakwa robat phai ka khubor sa ka sarkar pade ka sarkar kamdei ban klan ba kayeng bishar ka bahakli du jong kari India lani ka Supreme Court kalapas ya ka order ba ki labor department baro hapo ka state hapo jong ka ri India ki dei ban register ya ki domestic workers lani kinong treyeng lada ki ong ba baro ki state hapo India ka bambun ka kanthop ru ya ka jilla Meghalaya ka jongi te hakabaya dai bat kani nilai shong meeting labun sin bat ka labor department hapo ka jingyalam ka jong ki labor commissioner ki bala lesi ki bala sha transfer no
I think we've lost Kong Wan Punhun. Kong Wajoblin, is there anything you would like to say on this day of International Domestic Workers Day? Oh, Kong Wan Punhun is back.
yeah sorry
Do you
net
want to just finish your
compulsory registration ka baka Supreme Court kalapas te hakabay day bat kani kung mga laong mene bangila syong katu kadi tani ki meetings after meetings kidan tang kijing ya kren kidan tang kijing ya ai jingmut hingrai ka kam pada kam ya chulu kawan sakani ka lockdown hapdeng kawan sakani ka kajingwan shop sakani ka klam hapdeng te kani kala sakut no te kani kadai ka jingdawa ka jongi haba ka kayeng bishar ka bakli do kala pa se kata ka an mo bangi dei ban ka order bangi dei ban register ki bro batring bro ko mun ikni nanti ba hangni hapo jilla jongi ru ka sarkar kanle e ka badon kam dei tang ban register ki bro batring bro kayeng bishar ka bakli do ka ong ru ba ka sarkar ki ka labor department ka ban ai ya ki identity ka sia baro kinong training bro kabamot kinong training bro kinyo e ka jing itu da ka labor department kini ki shibun ki kam ki bangidang sa bangidang haban le te hingrai hakajing ya trai lang bat ki breu ki trai breu bat ki khat ki jongi ki bangila register mata ki lakot kumbanyo hajar mun ngangai scam bale se laga kini ki engim yo maru hingrai hakawai kisni kini ki jingele bat kini ki jing sha shitam jongi rangkat bat ki nin sayo hiu so bangi thai te ngai kublai pi baro market bok ke yang dan bok opini sha ye klein Finbaha kakamai kakaji, but pinangya ya chaprang kaji in Zaki, Bleshuba.
Kubleshibon kong panhan kong bajoblen fidane e ben share but hakne gasni.
Kumbala ong I meshan penhun kita kejingkran jangi meshan penhun barok khadami ki union leaders but ki ka union hi barok kawe ni shania but ni dang ya ap mi limti ba ka e ka ba ni dawa anlong kata ka ba seiso but ngadan tam ban ong khndet happy international domestic workers day ya barok ki domestic workers ki badan ha hashilong but kumje uru ha kiwe ki state ki jangi kata bani nila ban share dengan ka video ke nimdan ni issue hi ban om tang katahi kublai shibun.
Thank you so much. There are many other topics that we could have talked about. One of them is access of vaccinations for domestic workers, and there have been multiple experiences. But as we kind of just end this webinar, I just want to encourage everyone who's listening to make sure that they can assist those who need to get a vaccination. Maybe it's your domestic worker, maybe it's the person who is your guard at your house or works in your garden, whoever it might be. Please make sure that they get access to the vaccination as well. Maintain physical distance, wear a mask, wash your hands, sanitize, and take care of each other. Thank you so much, panelists. Thank you for spending this hour with us. And to all the viewers, thank you.
Thank you.